This is session 21, Overcoming Your Despair and Discouragement, part 1. In this part 1, we're going to discuss how despair develops, and in part 2, we're going to look at the antidote to despair. And we have come to the bottom of the way down chart. We've come to the bottom schematically. It's at the bottom of the chart, and also literally, this is at the bottom of the emotional spectrum. And Proverbs 12:25 speaks to this. It says, anxiety or heaviness, the word there is anxiety, in the heart of man maketh it stoop. What an apt description for a burdened, despairing heart. Anxiety in the heart of man maketh it stoop, but a good word maketh it glad. And we're going to speak of the words that make the heart glad when anxiety makes it stoop. There are depression, as the world speaks of it today, ranges along a continuum, and we want to look at, just to give us an idea of how we might think about this, we might speak of mild depression. Really what we're talking about there is discouragement. This is a loss of confidence, usually in respect to a particular area of life, and it's usually rather short-lived. Something didn't work out, and it's a little bit discouraging. Maybe for a college student or a career student, a career person, a date didn't work out, or a grade didn't come back as we had expected. Or for a married couple, a special time. It was going to be a wonderful anniversary or a wonderful dinner out, and something spoiled that, and it just didn't work out, and it's kind of discouraging. A sale didn't materialize, or there was an unexpected expense. And it just kind of hits us, and there's a bit of discouragement, and we might even think, oh, do I really even want to continue to try at this? And there's a loss of confidence that I should even try again. And most of those things stay for just a short time. When they linger, we would call these more of a serious depression. We would call it despondency. This is extended discouragement. There is an overall lowness of spirits and a difficulty recouping. We don't bounce back so quickly. And it's usually, this usually occurs when there's a disappointment over larger issues, or the issues of loss are over an extended period of time. The larger issue isn't just a sale doesn't come through, but I'm losing my health, or a continued financial spiral, or the marriage seems to be on the rocks or going the wrong direction here. And now we're talking about larger issues, and they extend for a longer period of time. And so there's a greater amount of discouragement here. And then at the bottom of this range is what might be called severe depression, and I call that despair. This is the total loss of hope and courage. It's a sense of helplessness and resignation. And we're going to speak about that. Now, I'm purposefully not using the word depression in this, and for this reason. It's a very broad term, very imprecise, and therefore generally very unhelpful. You know, a college student can come back to the room, got a bad grade, and say, and the roommate says, "What's wrong?" "Oh, I'm so depressed." You know, and so we use it for everything, every mood in this spectrum, and in the popular sense here. And what I'm really concerned about is despair, the sense of hopelessness. And if we learn how to handle that, we can handle any of the other losses that lead to that as well. So that's why I'm not using the word depression. I think it's quite imprecise, although in the psychological literature they have very precise definitions, but from the popular sense, that's not how it's used. So I want to use the word despair to talk about the hopelessness. But before we do that, I want to talk about another very legitimate emotion, and that is sorrow. This is a legitimate down feeling. Let's talk about the nature of sorrow. Number one, sorrow is the emotion of loss. The emotion of loss. It is also called grief, or metaphorically, we call it pain in the soul and hurt. And this is the emotion of loss. And I've addressed this at great length in the first and the last chapters of Created for His Glory. And let me just pull a couple of paragraphs out of that and just introduce you to this. Sorrow is the taste of death that permeates everything upon a fallen planet. It is the emotion of loss, the awareness that something has gone bad and isn't the way it was meant to be. It is a reminder that an essential of life is missing. It is the echo within our hearts that we were made for something better. It is a legitimate emotion for anyone who is truly reflecting, thinking upon life on a fallen planet. This is why it is often the characteristic of those who are more contemplative. Its heaviness grows as we think. Remember, our emotions are fueled by our thoughts. Sorrow is an emotion fueled by a thought of loss. Its heaviness grows as we think about the true nature of things in a fallen world. Those who never think seldom feel its weight. Indeed, this is exactly why many try not to think about life and its prospects. The weight of the sorrow seems to them to be too heavy to bear. So sorrow is when we look around at something that has happened to us, something has gone wrong in our lives. It can be as mundane as a flat tire. It can be or lost car keys. And there's a down feeling. God wired us to feel our losses. And if I lose my car keys, this is not severe depression, but there's this immediate down like, oh, it's this sense that something isn't right. Now, there isn't anything wrong with that. It's what I do next. It's just like the pain on my toe with that brick. That's not the problem. It's what, as far as my spiritual life is concerned, it's what I do next. The pain I experience is legitimate. How I respond to it is entirely a different issue. That can be sinful or it can be godly. Number two, this sorrow is the groaning, Paul called it groaning, in Romans 8, 22-23, and 2 Corinthians 5, 4. In Romans 8, he says, "For we know that the whole creation groaneth." This whole creation is burdened with this. "And travaileth in pain together until now. And not only," he says, "does the creation groan, but we ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for that adoption, the final adoption, that is the redemption of our body." And there's that longing for us to see and experience something different than what we see on this earth. And that's right for us to do so. In fact, if you look around at this world and all that's going on and look around at the relationships that you know about and what people are going through, your heart will be heavy. It should be heavy. If you work with people at all, you walk around continually with a heavy heart. That doesn't mean you can't have a rejoicing heart at the same time you have a heavy heart. We'll talk about that. But if you have your eyes open to what's going on in this world, what's going on in this world politically, what's going on economically, what's going on morally, what's going on in the culture, your heart ought to be heavy. And that's called sorrow. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is the sense in the heart that we have lost something. We have lost what God intended to happen in this creation, and one day it will be all put right. Paul spoke of this again in 2 Corinthians 5. He said, "For we that are in this tabernacle, or this temporary body, do groan, being burdened, not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life." He said, right now, while we're in this earthly tabernacle for this temporary time, we groan. And we can't wait for that tabernacle to be put off so we can stand complete in Christ. That ought to be the desire of every one of our hearts. Number three, let's take this a little step further. Losses over which we sorrow vary in intensity depending upon how much we valued the thing we lost. For example, the loss of your car keys certainly should have a different sorrowing effect than the loss of a loved one in death. Because we value the loved one more than we value our car keys, the sense of loss is greater. Now, another factor to keep in mind here, it says keep in mind that we may value something more than God intended. The loss will seem great even though the value is misplaced. Let's say that a teenage girl is dating an unsaved boy, and she's become very attached to him, very much likes him, wants to marry him, and he finds somebody else and rides off into the sunset. Okay, now, she's experiencing a loss to something that was valuable to her. Now, he shouldn't have been valuable to her because he's unsaved and she was pursuing an unequal yoke. But what I am saying is that we can put high value on something we shouldn't be putting high value upon and experience sorrow over that, even though it's the wrong thing. And we've got to understand that. Let's talk about some of these sorrows. There are sorrows over the loss of a loved one, as I mentioned, or the loss of a cherished possession or opportunity. There is loss of physical health, either gradually as we see it coming or through accident or disease. And when we think about, I don't have the function I used to have, I don't have the energy that I used to have, I don't have the rebound that I used to have when I got sick. And if you think about our bodies aren't the same way they were, there is a heaviness about that. That is not wrong. It's what you do next once you've experienced the heaviness, the sorrow. It's what do you do now? Do we get discontent with that? Or do we reaffirm what we know to be true about God and say, God, what this does is put me one step closer to you. When I came out of open heart surgery, when I went into open heart surgery, I just finished writing Change into His Image and spent that time with the Lord. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. And my father had just, I'd stood by his bed in the hospital about 10 months before that. And as we went back and forth, and then we went back and forth to the waiting room as we checked on him, and then he went to be with the Lord. I remember standing beside his bed and thinking, He beat me. He beat me to the Lord. He's there now. He's in a fully complete body. He has a totally unobstructed view of Jesus Christ, and he's just like him. That's what I want. And about 10 months later, I got my chance. And now my wife and family and others were praying that God would spare me, and He did. But my first thought waking up, when I got my thoughts collected a little bit, was, nuts! I'm still here. And I felt like Paul in Philippians 1:21, that, to be present here is more needful, but I want to depart and be with the Lord. And there is a sorrow when we look at what we are going through and what heaviness comes into our lives because of physical affliction and disease and dysfunction. And we ought to feel that heaviness, that sorrow about it. But what we do next is important. We can experience loss over control of our lives. We've moved to another town, perhaps, and teenagers and others experience this. You're going into your senior year in high school, and mom and dad have to transfer to another town, and now you can't graduate with all of your friends that you grew up with, and there's a loss. And there's a heaviness about that. There's nothing wrong with that if those were good friends and it was a good situation for you. There's nothing wrong with sorrowing, with missing that. Now, what you do next is important. Because you can get bitter about that, you can get angry about that, you can worry that you won't make new friends, and we can create all kinds of other problems. But the sense of loss is legitimate. Move to another town, that goes out of control, or there's some kind of interruption in our day. Or we find out that our husband is into pornography, or our son was just arrested, or our daughter just got pregnant, and she's unmarried, or our child is expelled from school, or a family member gets cancer. All of these things are out of our control, and they take our life. Our life begins spinning, and a lot of things going on, and we feel the heaviness of all of this. And there's nothing wrong with feeling that heaviness. In fact, if we didn't feel a heaviness, a sorrow over it, something's wrong with our thinking, because these are heavy matters. Or a loss of we experience a loss of favor or respect in someone's eyes because of failure in some way. Or it can be a loss of security. It can be a personal loss of security because of divorce or a job change or financial reversal. Or we can experience a loss in our national security with terrorism, economic instability, moral degradation. My heart is heavy thinking about what the young people today are going to face, what my grandchildren are going to face. When I think about that, my heart sorrows. And that ought to burden us to do something, and that is not just, find some caves in the hills to hide in. It ought to burden us to pray. It ought to burden us to teach them the Word like we've never taught the Word before. It ought to burden us to do some things like that. But the heaviness ought to be there. We can experience a loss of purity or innocence because of personal moral sins or being sinned against in a moral fashion by somebody else. And with all of that, we can also experience a loss of fellowship with God. Things aren't the way they're supposed to be. They aren't the way they used to be. Now, folks, all of these losses are things that we may experience throughout our life, or folks we're working with or helping or family members are experiencing these things. It's helpful to understand and important to understand that feeling down is not sinful. If you got your thinking cap on and you're looking around and sensing what is going on, your heart ought to be heavy with this. That's not despair. Paul called it groaning. Number 4, in fact, Jesus experienced sorrow in the garden when he contemplated the coming loss of fellowship with his Father. He was not depressed. He was anticipating the coming separation from his Father and the anticipated hurt that he would experience in bearing the sin of the world and facing an excruciating execution. He was not in the garden depressed. He was in the garden sorrowing. His heart was heavy with all of this. What do you do with a heavy heart? You do the same thing Jesus did. You say, Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And folks, you can only make that kind of surrender if you trust the one who's at the helm of all of that. And you have to know him well enough to trust him. Trusting God doesn't mean that he's going to keep you from crucifixion. It does mean that he will keep you from sinning while you're crucified. The spiritual rescue is more important than anything else. It doesn't mean that it'll keep you from a fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not expect to come out of that furnace. But they knew they had to go in, and they were going in with the grace of God. Trusting God doesn't always mean that he's going to keep you from the fire, as he did Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. Hebrews 11 is a testimony of that. Many of them did not receive their dead raised again. Many of them wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, and they were sawn asunder. And all of these people they were not delivered in a physical fashion, but they were delivered from denying their God in the process. That's our goal. The goal isn't to stay out of every fiery furnace in life. The goal is that God keeps my heart stable enough so that I don't deny him to stay out of the fiery furnace when I have to go into it. But let's look at the nature of despair. Despair is sorrow without hope. Now that is an important definition. It is experiencing these losses without hope. It is the emotion of hopelessness. 1 Thessalonians 4:13, Paul said, But I would not have you ignorant, my brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not as others who have no hope. He said, all of those who have gone before you and have died, they are going to be resurrected at the final trump of God, at that rapture. And he said, yes, we sorrow that they have died, but we don't sorrow as those other people in this world who sorrow, who have no hope. Despair is sorrowing without hope. In fact, 1 Peter, the apostle addresses this. Peter is writing to a suffering people in 1 Peter. They've been scattered about in Cappadocia, Bithynia, all of these areas in Asia Minor because of persecution, and they're having a hard time. And their loving pastor from the first church in Jerusalem writes them. And he talks about this living hope, Jesus Christ and the inheritance that he has prepared for us and the sustaining, preserving that he's going to do to present us to himself in that time. And he says, you have this living hope in which you rejoice, though now, if need be, you are in heaviness. You rejoice, though now you are in heaviness. You can have rejoicing and heaviness in the same heart. You rejoice, though now you are in heaviness through manifold temptations or trials, knowing this, that this trying of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, might be found unto honor and praise and glory at his appearing. And Peter said there is a way you can face life where you have a rejoicing in this eternal hope. At the same time, you have heaviness because of what is going on. And you know how he tells you to do this? He says in the 2nd chapter, gird up the loins of your mind. This is no time for sloppy thinking. When you're under persecution, when you're under suffering, when you have a lot of sorrow going on, this is a time to watch your thinking. And I've told you many times, track your thinking, not your feelings. Peter said that. Gird up the loins of your mind. This is no time for sloppy thinking, and hope to the end. Look what is coming. Look what He has given. Number 2, hope is much more strategic in our immediate and long-term contentment than most people realize. No one continues long in any endeavor if there is no hope of any kind. Point number 3, sorrow without hope or despair is intensified when laced with self-pity. Now you can be sorrowing over something you've lost, and if you're sorrowing without hope, it's generally because your hope was in the thing you lost. Here's a girl sorrowing over this boyfriend that just took off with somebody else. And there went her hope. She thought he was going to be the solution. Now she's sorrowing without hope. And if you really want to make this dangerous, then add self-pity to it. Those are statements like, why does this always happen to me? I never get the breaks others get. No one cares about me. I always get the bad end of the stick. And the flesh here of self-centeredness is corrupting the thinking. And we will sow what we reap. Self-pity is a self-focused thinking instead of God and others focused. Number 4, sorrow without hope or despair is further intensified when accompanied by blame shifting. It wasn't my fault. It wouldn't have happened if you would have whatever. If my family hadn't moved last year, I wouldn't have faced this temptation and failed. Shifting the blame. Somebody else. It's the wife you gave me, Lord. It's the serpent. Christians living in unbelief about the nature of God and unbelievers who don't know God at all have no stable hope. Their hope is bound up in whether someone or something will come through for them somehow. And this matter of despair is a rising phenomenon in our culture. And I really believe that our greatest evangelistic opportunities in the days ahead are going to be connecting with people who are in despair. By the way, that is how Solomon connected with the philosophical thinkers of his day in Ecclesiastes. He made them think of the despair of life and offered them a solution. This is how Paul connected to those when he was on Mars Hill, when he was in Greece. And he saw their tomb to the unknown God. And he said, I see that you are very superstitious and very religious in all these matters. And you even want to have all your bases covered. And you have this one to the unknown God. I want to tell you who He is. And he took their own search and connected with that and said, here's your answer. Now that's what we must do. So we understand, I hope, what sorrow is and what despair is. Despair is sorrowing without hope. Now, let's look how this can further be complicated. Let's look at the complication of physical illness. Number 1, physical disease and dysfunction can cause feelings of depression, even if the patient is not entertaining hopeless thoughts of despair. We've already looked at that with anxiety, and there are many diseases and dysfunctions that can cause a person to feel down even if he's not thinking unbiblically. That's important to understand. But we still have to watch our thoughts. Understand again, no bodily condition generates thoughts. It can generate feelings of being down, but no bodily condition generates thoughts. The heart generates our thoughts. God's very clear about that. That is why when we talk about somebody entertaining suicidal thoughts, those thoughts, now his body may be down for any number of reasons. He may not have been sleeping well. He may not have been eating well. He may have some other kind of dysfunction in his body. But that tempts him, like the brick on the toe, tempts him to think wrongly about life. And now he begins entertaining thoughts. The world would be better off without me. I just want to have Scotty beam me up. I don't want to be here anymore. I just want out. Okay, folks, those thoughts are not generated by his body. They come from his heart. And the blessing about that is that because they come from the heart, there's not always a good solution for the body, but there's always a good solution for the heart. This gives us a lot of hope. Remember, a student was sent by the clinic over to see me some time ago, and this has been several years ago. And he was very distressed and despairing and thinking suicidal thoughts. And they sent him over and said, "You need to talk to somebody." And I got talking with him about what is going on. And I mean, there's some disappointments in his grades and things like that. But basically, the more we talked, what came out was that his goal in life was to be like Donald Trump. Rich and wealthy and powerful and all that sort of thing. And I said, "No wonder you want to end your life." And I said, I'm saying this very, very seriously. You have come to the right conclusion that life lived with that goal in mind is not worth living. That is the right conclusion. You have come to the right conclusion. Now, you're wanting to do the wrong thing about it, but you have formed the right conclusion that life the way you're living is not worth living. And you're talking about suicide, which means you're willing to entertain something radical. I'm glad you're willing to tackle something radical, because that's exactly what you need. Now let's roll up our sleeves and get your thinking straightened out and your heart submitted to God and give up this ungodly goal and start thinking right. And he did. But those thoughts were not generated by some condition in his body. They were generated by a heart that had adopted a wrong goal, and then he began to realize, I will never get that. That's hopelessness. And I want to live if I can't have my goal. And he's supposed to feel like it's worth giving up. Number 2, physical disease and dysfunction can introduce many losses into a person's life, which further complicate his situation. So, as the first bullet says, some of these losses include loss of function. These are physical things. Loss of function. Economic loss from medical expenses and time away from work. Sometimes loss of freedom and mobility. Loss of social interaction as a patient is bedridden or confined to a hospital or to home and so forth. So when we have the physical problem that already induces some down feelings to us, we also may be experiencing some losses on top of all of that. That still means, however, folks, with God's grace, we can still think right, as long as our brain is still plugged in. Now, some disease can affect that, where like Alzheimer's and dementia, where you don't have the full function of your brain. But as long as you've got your brain, God help you and God bless you, you can think right. Even though the body may be deteriorating and we're experiencing all of these other losses. Next bullet says, if a person is thinking unbiblically about these losses, he can begin to experience feelings of despair. That's hopelessness. And can actually intensify his feelings of physical pain. And thirdly, while physical illness may not be a direct result of someone's spiritual decline, the presence of physical illness always introduces a spiritual component into the scene, calling for a godly response to the dysfunction. All of our physical problems may not be caused by spiritual problems, but every physical problem introduces a new spiritual problem to us. How are we going to respond to this now? It's a complication of the physical part of life. Let's look at, lastly, at the complication of overload. While we would like to think that we'd like to find physical problems for the reasons we're down and not feeling well and all that sort of thing, we need to look very carefully and honestly at this component. Number 1, adding to the normal losses of living in a sin-cursed planet are the pressures we create in modern society by overcommitment of our schedules and underdevelopment of our spiritual lives. That combination is dangerous. Overcommitment of our schedules and underdevelopment of our physical lives. Life's not supposed to work that way. The result is overwhelm, the loss of equilibrium due to overload. We have introduced far greater demands into our lives than we have resources to meet. That's what that sagging bridge illustration in session 3 was all about. Let me give you a quote from a medical doctor who has written extensively about this. He says, And number two, the spontaneous tendency of our culture is to inexorably add detail to our lives. One more option, one more problem, one more commitment, one more expectation, one more purchase, one more debt, one more change, one more job, one more decision. We must now deal with more things per person than at any other time in history. Yet one can comfortably handle only so many details in his or her life. Exceeding this threshold will result in disorganization or frustration. It is important to note here that the problem is not in the details, the problem is in the exceeding. This is called overloading. And we have temptations from every direction in our lives to add one more thing and buy one more thing and so forth, and take on one more responsibility. In session 18, we looked at perfectionistic behaviors, the preoccupation with orderliness to maintain some control. This kind of a person places heavy demands on himself. Perfectionistic people overload. They have high expectations for themselves, do far more than they need to. And they have high demands on other people, and those, particularly their leaders, who don't come through for them, and that creates overload for them. This is a very critical thing we ought to look at. Number three, much of this overload is caused by the same discontent fueled by our unbelief that drives our anxiety, anger, and despair, as we've already seen. A discontented heart is always desiring something more. As with Proverbs' fool, our desire is killing us. Remember Hebrews 13:5 and 6, let your lifestyle, your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Number four, the solution to overload is not merely pruning our schedules, simplifying our lives, and eliminating the glut of time-saving appliances that add to our frustration, though we may indeed need to do all of these things. The long-term solution is to discover from the Scriptures the reality that God is more than enough for me. We must correct our unbelief, repent of our discontent, and find in our relationship with the Lord Jesus the satisfaction we are seeking in other activities and possessions. We're one of the only civilizations in the world where most of the people can get what they want. It's never been that way in most civilizations in the history of man, except with the extremely wealthy. And most of us are extremely wealthy by the world's standards. We can pretty much have what we want. So, well, I don't have everything I want. You have more than most people ever have. And we have overloaded ourselves. The conclusion is, once again, we're back to where we started as we studied the way down. If you don't have the view of God and relationship with Jesus Christ right, nothing can be right. Indeed, God is more than enough for us. And in the next session, we'll look at the antidote to despair.